Hello, my name's Dr. Bonnie McBain. I'm from the University of Newcastle and I'm here representing a larger project team which includes Liam Phelan, Anna Ferguson, Paul Brown, Val Brown, Ian Hay, Richard Horsfield, Ros Taplin and Daniela Tilbury. Today I'd like to tell you about a participatory approach we use to building learning standards for environmental and sustainability higher education in Australia. I'll talk about the inherent complexity of such a task, that is, the fact that it's dynamic, really diverse and a contested field of environmental education. I'll then step through the approach to standards development that we use to address these complexities. But first, I want to set the context for the task. The development of standards was commissioned by the Australian Council of Environmental Deans and Directors, which is a national association of university leaders at Australian higher education institutions. And they have a responsibility for environmental and sustainability degree programs in Australia. So funding for the standards development was won from the Australian Office of Teaching and Learning, and the objectives of the project was to describe the threshold learning outcomes for environment and the sustainability field. So technically, the threshold learning outcomes are the minimum learning that all graduates must attain upon graduation from an Australian environmental or sustainability higher education coursework program. The description of minimum learning was not a term that sounded particularly inspiring. So instead, we often used the equivalent but more positive terminology such as the essential or the critical learning required. The project had the following aims. So number one, we wanted to develop inspiring and workable learning standards for environmental education in Australia that reflect best practice in international standards and development and were understandable and accessible. Our second aim was to consult widely to ensure the standards were owned and strongly supported by broad consensus among scholars in environmental and sustainability-related disciplines, with environmental educators more widely, and environmental practitioners. And we wanted to also, as part of the third aim of this project, to strengthen the sense of community among environmental education scholars across really diverse disciplinary bases. So we recognised quite early on in the project that the development of the standards would present a number of complexities. First was the changeable nature of environmental education over time. So during the 70s, environmental education was largely centred on physical sciences with a focus on primary learning about and then in the environment. And then in the 80s, the concept of sustainability started to emerge. And by the 90s, environmental education had evolved further and began to broaden its focus to engage more explicitly with people and their actions, and to embrace a more normative motivation for achieving sustainability. And so in contemporary environmental education has now got a distinction through its focus on education for the environment. And education for the environment is understood to be a normative goal that must be negotiated for the purposes of creating change, i.e. disrupting and transforming resilient but undesirable paradigms of thinking and doing. And this requires a shared vision towards a different and more sustainable future. So current environmental education is the product of this historical journey, and the complexity comes from the fact that all of these various approaches are still evident in environmental education today. The history of environmental education has also been mirrored by this parallel but interrelated development that has occurred in environmental management. So historically, management assumed that the environment would respond linearly and predictably to management because it was inherently knowable given sufficient rational and reductionist scientific study. Over the same time frame, a paradigm shift in environmental management also occurred. So in the 1970s, there was a presumption that rationalist and reductionist approaches assumed that nature was controllable enough to be able to manage it. And more recently, a more holistic environmental management has been driven by a growing awareness that the interconnectedness of natural and international sustainability challenges. This has meant that environmental management has become fundamentally a more than disciplinary and integrated field across many disciplines, from humanities to social and natural sciences. Both the reductionist and the more holistic approaches to managing the environment continue to persist in the practice of environmental management. And this, in turn, then informs the skills that are expected from those graduating from environmental education programs. And so we see this dynamic tension that has resulted between the past reductionist approaches and the more contemporary holistic approaches. Despite being inclusive of varied disciplines, in practice, environmental management and environmental education are typically housed in very siloed, discipline-based institutions. In the higher education institutions, environmental education is typically found in science departments because of this historical link with reductionist approaches, which originally came from science. And the implications stemming from these historical developments of environmental education and environmental management are that environmental education, that is the field characterised by multiple viewpoints and perspectives and very contested meanings about what the key issues are, how to understand them, what to do about them, and ultimately, for the purpose of this work, what students of environmental and sustainability education should learn. So the design of higher education curricula is informed by varying degrees by the skill sets required by employers, but this learning cannot be informed by the requirements of the current workforce alone. It must also challenge and improve current practice. It must cultivate the skill sets of graduates so that they can take part in a transition to sustainability. And this tension exists between current practice in the workforce and the transformative practice required if greater sustainability is to be achieved. And it's in this context that our higher education sector must ensure that graduates have the skills to take on these roles. The learning standards or competencies are one such mechanism that can contribute to this outcome. The development of learning standards for sustainability graduates can be more complex to develop than some other fields, and this is because environmental roles not only require students to work within existing institutional systems, but they also require them to make changes to these systems. The skills involving group processes are also required, and judgments are required where conflicting interests and incomplete information are common. So building the standards in the context of this complexity was a key background context that we needed to deal with. And the sheer disciplinary and sectoral diversity of the field, its nexus between economic and social and physical systems, and its really dynamic history, and also the fact that its interests are implicated in some of the most wicked problems that we face in Australia and also the world, meant that building learning standards in a field of environmental education really required an approach which could account for complexity. So standards development was also challenged by the different perspectives of what environmental education is and what it should be, and also the broad range of circumstances in which learning will be applied. The last challenge we faced was that the standards would not be formally audited by the federal institution funding their development. Instead, they were to be used as a curriculum reference point that was voluntarily applied into environmental degrees. So rather than just being a box-ticking exercise, we really needed a mechanism that encouraged their authentic application. So what I want to do now is step through how we engage with these various complexities to develop the learning standards. Our methodology in the project used action research, which is an approach to learning through engaging with a group of peers and which provides a reflective space, support, and a challenge to work through problems, often with normative goals. To guide our action research, we used variations of the adaptive assessment and environmental management approach, which was documented by Gunderson, Peterson and Holling in their paper published in 2008, titled Practicing Adaptive Management in Complex Sociological Systems. Adaptive assessment and management is a formal iterative cycle of continual experimentation, learning and adjusting. Adaptive assessment and management together become necessary because complex systems are unpredictable, the knowledge of the system will always be imperfect, and the high levels of uncertainty face all the decision makers in that context. It's the process of assessment that makes this distinct from adaptive management that's more commonly used on its own. So adaptive assessment starts with building conceptual models. And conceptual models are a way to articulate how we understand something. What are the critical bits of the system and how do they relate to each other? And conceptual models are likely to differ significantly between different stakeholder groups. So building conceptual models collaboratively with stakeholders allows us to identify what we know about a system, to learn from one another, to adapt our knowledge with new information, and thereby creating a shared understanding. And where shared understanding cannot be achieved, we have the opportunity of then identifying uncertainties or alternative explanations. And these uncertainties form the hypothesis, which we then test in subsequent collaborative work in adaptive management. So integral to this process is transdisciplinarity and social learning. Social learning is integral to adaptive assessment and management, given that no single profession or person can have all the answers to complex issues. The process of social learning then brings together participants who share their perspectives and learn from the perspectives of others. Authentic social learning must include a number of components or strands if it is to open up the possibility of transdisciplinary practice. It has to have reflection, systems thinking, an integration component, a participatory component, and engagement through negotiation. Transdisciplinary approaches are suitable for these complex problems whose full understanding lies beyond individuals or individual disciplines. Transdisciplinary research has the potential to develop new insights as a result of synthesizing a range of varied understandings. So we had a small project team who I've mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, and that was established at the beginning of the project and was to be responsible for its undertaking. The team was deliberately diverse so that members could challenge each other's particular way of understanding environmental education. It was at this scale that transdisciplinary work was to take place via adaptive environmental assessment and management. The team comprised of national and international leaders in environmental education, in the higher education sector, together with early career educators and practitioners in the field. Experience in higher education sector was complemented with out-of-sector experience from community, industry, government, non-government organisations. The team came from a diverse set of universities from across Australia, and care was taken to ensure there was a gender balance. The team was supported by a project manager with extensive experience in participatory decision-making in the workforce, And an external evaluator also joined the team to ensure that the project remained aligned with its goals and was implemented to a high quality. The interaction between the team members formally in meetings and informally in discussions around the standards development was set up to maximise the possibility that the team could engage authentically with the 5 strands of social learning: reflection, systems thinking, integration, participation, and negotiation. For instance, many of the team members kept project journals in which they could reflect on the progress of standards development. Adaptive assessment and management also requires tight feedback loops. And I present some examples of feedback loops in the project. For instance, disciplinary scholars who had led the involvement of standard development in other disciplines were contacted early in the beginning of the project to informally to understand what they had learned from their own standards development process and what they might do differently given a second opportunity. And their feedback was used by the project team to anticipate project challenges and to nuance the approach taken within the project. A formal evaluation plan was also designed collaboratively between the project team and the external evaluator at the beginning of the project. And this plan defined the timing and the data to be used for project evaluation. These data were collected at 3 points during the project, and this really enabled the project team to review the effectiveness of the project and to revise our approach where evaluation identified discrepancies between the desired outcomes and the current practice. The extensive experience of the Australian Council of Environmental Deans and Directors was also used as a sounding board of advice at intervals throughout the project. So the first job of the project team was to draft the first version of the standards, and this served as the first hypothesis in the adaptive assessment process. This first draft was then built from a review of the international environmental education literature, a review of other disciplinary learning standards in Australia, and the combined experience of the project team members. This draft was understood from the methodology of adaptive assessment and management to be the first policy hypothesis, which is an immature conceptual model yet to be critically examined to reveal uncertainties and specific to the Australian context and the diverse experience of stakeholders in the field. Subsequent to versions of the standards were then refined by broadening the participation and expertise in order to test our first hypothesis with alternative explanations. We did this by forming a reference group, and the diversity of the reference group helped to evaluate this first hypothesis. The membership of the reference group was critical, and it reflected the diversity in frontline environment and sustainability teachers and practitioners. It also included diversity from disciplinary backgrounds, from humanities, social sciences, science and technological sciences and engineering. It also had a range of representation from different career trajectories. For instance, we had a mix of early career, mid-career and senior members. And lastly, a state and institutional spread also added diversity. And finally, there was a gender and sectoral spread in this team. This team reviewed the first draft of the standards and then came together in a one-day workshop to identify any inconsistencies and uncertainties and actually to negotiate alternatives where it was required. This subsequent version of the standards then formed the second policy hypothesis. The next stage of the project was then to broaden participation in decision-making further in order to test this second hypothesis. The engagement of these stakeholders took place using 3 main approaches. So first we had open space face-to-face workshops. We had also targeted surveys and phone calls. And finally, we had dedicated online web hosted discussion fora. A total of 8 face-to-face workshops were undertaken, mainly in capital cities across Australia, using open space and World Cafe methodologies combined. These approaches were chosen for their effectiveness in reviewing issues with high levels of complexity and diversity, and where conflicting views have the potential to be present. They were available. The time frames on which we were to build the standards was also a challenge, and so these 2 processes in the workshop allowed us to resolve issues in a very short time frame, given that the project only took place over 12 months. In total, we had over 165 participants involved in these workshops, and they included industry and employer representatives, academics, students, and environmental educators in other sectors. The structure of each workshop was designed to encourage holistic or systems thinking. There were 3 main stages in each workshop. First, we posed an open-ended question to participants. What attributes and skills do students graduating from environmental and sustainability bachelor degrees need? Participants were first asked to consider their responses to the question individually and without discussion with others, and this was to elicit answers faithful to their individual experience. This is very important if one's to minimise groupthink. Participants were then came together in a multidisciplinary groups between 4 to 10 people to integrate their individual answers in a process of participatory sense-making and negotiation. The framing of the approach as one of joint problem solving really emphasised the commonalities across stakeholders with diverse values. Importantly, it's also highlighted the differences. The findings from each group were displayed whilst participants were asked to vote with the use of 5 stickers per participant. They voted for the attributes and skills that they thought were most important across their own group, but also in the findings of other groups. This prioritisation process then informed the next workshop question. In light of the collaborative learning undertaken during the first stage of the workshop, participants were then asked during the second stage of the workshop to critique the draft standards. Once again, this was done individually first, and then together in small multidisciplinary groups. The third and final stage of the workshop brought together all the participants to discuss the overall findings, and this provided a larger context for the small group discussions and the negotiations. Each workshop also set aside time for participants to network informally with one another and to encourage the building of relationships. At the completion of each workshop, participants were asked to provide feedback to the project team about the findings of the workshop itself and the quality of the participation. The project team summarised workshop findings the day following the workshop and sent this summary directly to participants on that day. And this closed the feedback loop to all participants that took place and left open further opportunities for less formal ongoing contributions. The next round of engagement at the end of stage 1, we identified which stakeholder groups had not been involved in decision making during stage 1 of the consultation. The analysis found that industry representatives, Aboriginal peoples, and undergraduate students had not been sufficiently represented. In response to that, a total of 163 underrepresented stakeholder groups were invited via personal email to participate in the next stage of engagement. We sent 800 invitations to online discussion forums, and the online survey was also used to engage regional stakeholders who hadn't been able to make it to the capital city workshops. And these stakeholders were invited with over 700 general emails. A student Q&A session was also held at the University of Newcastle campus to target undergraduate students who'd not been previously involved in the workshop. And finally, key Aboriginal contacts with large networks in the Aboriginal community were then approached to invite broader Indigenous input into the standards development process also. So a total of 86 further responses during stage 2 of the engagement were received. The distribution of the target stakeholder group increased in breadth significantly as a result of these combined consultation stages. And we also received participation from Indigenous stakeholders that seemed low, but most of the time we had groups of stakeholders collaborating and then inputting their expertise into the process. And this really changed how we had drafted the learning outcomes significantly. And you'll see that there are 2 very explicit learning outcomes that refer to Indigenous learning and the importance of that in the sustainability field. So finally, we were able to understand that our stakeholder representation was enough in able to combine all the different expertise into the learning standards. And we then tested those draft standards using pilot testing. And this process was in order to reveal the draft standards that were whether they were understood and whether they were useful and whether they were actually usable. And there were 3 different universities who volunteered to pilot the learning outcomes. And through that piloting process, we asked a number of questions. So first, did the standards allow for a program's particular focus and emphasis? And this was to ensure that the standards allow for the diversity of programs offered by Australian universities, which is very broad. And secondly, we asked them to practically assess, did the standards give them the opportunity to demonstrate alignment or otherwise of the program against the standard which the standards were compared. And this was to ensure that the standards were usable in practice. The learning from these case studies informed minor and final revisions of the draft standards, and the penultimate version of the standards was reviewed and endorsed by the Australian Council of Environmental Deans and Directors. So this is a very quick outline of the process that we use to address the complexity of standards development in the environmental and sustainability spheres. The standards now apply nationally to the Australian higher education sector as a curriculum reference point for degrees in sustainability and environmental management. Happily, the project won a National Higher Education Award, the Australian Green Gowns Award, for contributions to teaching and learning in sustainability in 2015. The standards have actually been taken up from a highly diverse and extensive experience that contributed to their development. The project has fostered the building of consensus across a broad and very diverse field, and the standards have emphasised both the essential and ambitious components of contemporary tertiary environmental education because of the diverse participation in decision-making. And this is especially true for stakeholders often excluded from decision-making. The capacity building that resulted during the stakeholder collaborations had immediate benefit for the quality of teaching and learning. One of the workshop participants noted that there are many things I have personally learnt today, and I will apply them to my own learning in future education. And lastly, the standards have already been used to inform the design of many higher education programs in the field. And this is a critical outcome as the standards are voluntarily applied by the higher education institutions. In the year after their publication, there were already more than 10 separate degree programs across Australia which had been revised to align with the standards. A colleague from the National Council of Science and the Environment in the USA has also sought guidance on how to develop learning standards for environmental education, and he's basing a lot of what he's doing from learning that we've undergone, and they're trying to replicate a very similar process in the USA. So I'd like to complete the presentation at this point, and I'll share with you 3 questions that will hopefully help to discuss this process in more detail, and hopefully we can all share our expertise during the subsequent question time. Thank you, and we'll talk very soon.